Okay, let's unpack this. You often hear a particular line of argument, right? When people talk about the historical impact, especially, the positive side of a major global force.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about Christianity here specifically. And the argument often comes down to this idea that it brought civilization around the world.
Yeah, and people often point to these stories of individual change, these transformations.
Yeah.
The happy convert idea.
Exactly, the happy convert. And they use that as proof that the overall effect was overwhelmingly positive.
It's definitely a narrative with a lot of cultural weight. It shapes how people see missionary history, religious expansion.
It focuses on progress, moral improvement, personal change.
And attributes all that directly to Christian faith arriving on the scene.
And, on the surface, it feels quite powerful, doesn't it? If someone genuinely feels their life is better, they found meaning or happiness.
Yeah. No, it seems good.
It feels intuitive, yeah. You see those stories, you think, okay, positive impact. But the source we're really digging into today, it takes a really sharp, critical look at that exact argument, and maybe more importantly, the way it gets presented.
Right, so this whole deep dive today is built around just one source. It's an article by Jorge Garapires, a Ph.D.
Okay.
And the title tells you a lot. The Fallacy of the Happy Convert. What Lennox doesn't say about Christianity's expansion.
The fallacy, so it's definitely a critique.
Oh yeah, a focused one. And our job today really is just to understand that specific critique. We're sticking only to what Pires lays out in this article.
Got it. So think of this as an extraction mission for you, the listener. We're pulling out Pires' key arguments, the history he uses, the philosophical points, any surprising claims he makes, just from this one piece.
Exactly. We're not here to judge if Pires is right or wrong or bring in other views. The goal is singular. Understand the specific perspective on Christianity's expansion and how its legacy is debated based only on what Jorge Garapires wrote here.
It's like a deep dive into one specific critical viewpoint. By focusing just on Pires, we can really explore the details of his argument, the evidence he uses, the conclusions he draws.
Which lets you, listening, get a really detailed picture of this particular critique of that common happy convert narrative. It's all about this article's perspective.
Precisely. We're basically taking a guided tour through Pires' article to see what he finds problematic about certain defenses of Christianity's historical impact. So let's dive in. Who's the central figure Pires is critiquing, and what's the specific argument he targets?
Well, Pires immediately zeroes in on John Lennox.
Okay, the Christian apologist and mathematician.
That's the one. And Pires highlights a particular quote from Lennox, using it as a sort of launch pad for his entire critique. He clearly thinks this quote is very revealing.
What's the quote?
According to Pires, Lennox said, "Without Christian evangelism, Africa would be left with Nike, the witch doctor, the mobile phone, and the machete."
Wow. Okay. That's quite a mix of images. Nike, witch doctor, phone, machete.
It's dark, yeah.
So how does Pires say Lennox uses this quote? What's the point Lennox is making, according to Pires' reading?
Pires argues that Lennox uses it to push this idea of Christianity having an essential civilizing role in Africa.
Ah, the civilizing mission idea again.
Exactly. In this view, Christianity isn't just about spiritual stuff. It's presented as this necessary force stopping societies from being, well, overwhelmed by negative things.
Like consumerism, Nike, superstition, witch doctor, basic tech, phone, and violence, machete.
That's how Pires interprets it. He sees Lennox using this quote to defend the positive necessity of missionary work, especially outside the West.
But Pires' reaction is not positive, I take it.
Not at all. He immediately labels that quote right in the article as deeply problematic. He calls it paternalistic and colonialist.
Your words.
He doesn't mince them, and he explains why he sees it that way. Pires argues the quote implies that African societies without Christianity are basically just primitive, violent, and superstitious. And the only other things Lennox mentions are, like, Western consumer goods and basic tech. Pires says choosing witch doctor and machete specifically plays on these old, harmful stereotypes about Africa.
Right. Stereotypes used to justify colonialism.
Precisely. Pires presents the quote as rooted in a kind of supremacist logic, very similar, he says, to the arguments used by colonial missionaries who saw themselves as civilizing, supposedly savage people.
That historical connection is key to his critique then. But Pires also talks about how these arguments are delivered, doesn't he? He contrasts Lennox with someone like Richard Dawkins.
He does. This is where it gets interesting. Pires notes Lennox's style, usually very calm, polite, measured in debates.
Yeah, that's often noted.
And he contrasts that with critics like Dawkins, who Pyers describes as often being more direct, confrontational, maybe even aggressive sometimes.
Okay, and Pyers sees this difference in style as significant.
More than significant. He calls it a trap.
A trap. How so?
The Pyers argues that, in a public debate, the calm, polite person often just looks better. The optics favor them.
Right, calmness can seem more reasonable than anger or forcefulness.
Exactly. Lennox seems composed, maybe more likable, compared to a more fiery Dawkins. And Pyers' worry, which he lays out, is that people watching might focus too much on the tone.
So they're drawn to the politeness?
Or put off by the perceived aggression.
And they miss the actual substance of what's being said.
That's Pyers' point. He fears that potentially dangerous or, problematic ideas hiding behind that calm exterior just don't get challenged. They slip by because they aren't delivered loudly or aggressively.
So Pyers is saying, look past the delivery. Focus on the core ideas because he sees significant issues there.
That's the essence of it. Pyers believes that beneath the calm, seemingly benevolent surface, there lies what he calls an ideological defense of Christian imperialism.
Imperialism, that's a strong charge.
He argues it's not just a neutral observation about positive effects, but a constructed argument that, maybe intentionally, maybe not, ends up justifying historical and ongoing power dynamics tied to religious expansion.
And he sees this as only thinly disguised as just, faith-based goodwill.
That's Pyers' perspective, yes.
Yeah.
Just thinly disguised.
And Pyers connects this stance directly to real-world harms, doesn't he? Both historical and ongoing ones.
He does. He lists specific things he claims Lennox's framework tends to excuse or minimize or distract from. Things like colonialism, slavery.
Serious historical issues.
Definitely. And also educational suppression, which probably means things like imposing certain curricula or dismissing local knowledge systems, and even spreading disinformation.
Disinformation, how does he connect that?
Pyers gives a really specific and quite stark contemporary example here. He talks about anti-condom campaigns in several African countries.
Okay.
And he directly attributes these campaigns, or the influence behind them, to certain religious institutions, specifically in the context of Christian expansion.
Right, and the consequences.
Pyers states very clearly that this disinformation is, in his words, fueling the HIV/AIDS crisis with deadly consequences in those places.
Wow, so he's linking a specific religious teaching or campaign directly to a major public health crisis.
Yes, and his point is, while debates might focus on Christianity stopping witch doctors and machetes, these actual documented present-day harms, which Pyers attributes to religious influence, often get ignored.
This leads Pyers into critiquing Lennox's method when these kinds of harms are brought up, right? He talks about a logical fallacy.
Yes, the no True Scotsman fallacy. Pyers accuses Lennox of using this frequently.
How does that work in this context?
Well, Pyers' interpretation is that whenever someone points to, say, historical atrocities or current harms done by people or groups identifying as Christian.
Like the Crusades or slave owners or maybe these anti-condom campaigns.
Right. Lennox, according to Pyers, responds by saying, but those weren't real Christians.
Okay.
So the argument becomes, anything bad can't be blamed on real Christianity, because real Christianity is defined as something purely good that wouldn't do those things.
It's a bit circular, isn't it? If they did something bad, they weren't true Christians by definition.
That's exactly the criticism Pyers levels. And he argues it's not just a philosophical game. He calls it a form of selective historical memory.
How so?
Because, Pyers claims, it acts as a way to kind of sanitize history. It cleanses the record of centuries of exploitation, violence, oppression done by people and institutions acting in the name of Christianity. It protects the core narrative that the religion itself is fundamentally good.
Pyers then expands on this, saying Lennox uses asymmetrical reasoning. What does he mean by that?
Pyers makes a pretty pointed accusation here. He says Lennox holds atheism, or secular worldviews, responsible for the actions of their, let's say, worst adherents.
Oh.
Pyers specifically mentions Lennox connecting atheism to regimes like Stalin's Russia, arguing that a world without Christianity or dominated by atheism is inherently dangerous and leads to suffering. Pyers calls these claims about atheism baseless, by the way.
Okay, so on one side, Lennox, in Pyers' view, links the worst actions of atheists or secular states directly to the lack of belief itself.
Correct. But then, Pyers argues, when faced with Christianity's own worst crimes, the historical issues, the contemporary harms Pyers mentioned, Lennox excuses the religion itself using that no true Scotsman move.
Ah, so the bad actions are just down to individuals who weren't real Christians, not the faith or institution.
That's Pyre's claim about the asymmetry. The belief system itself is absolved of responsibility for its negative historical associations.
And Pyre sees this as a major flaw, especially for a public intellectual like Lennox.
He really does. He calls this approach both philosophically weak, because it uses different standards for different worldviews, and morally evasive.
Evasive because?
Because, Pyres argues, it lets the proponent avoid really grappling with the difficult history of their own tradition while happily pointing fingers at the perceived flaws of others.
And Pyre connects this back to the tone argument, the politeness factor.
Yes, he circles back. He says, look, maybe Dawkins' style grates on people, maybe it's abrasive, but Pyres feels Dawkins, whatever else you might say, doesn't try to sugarcoat history in the same way.
He's more direct about the negative stuff in religion's past.
That's Pyre's view. And his conclusion from this is quite striking. He argues that precisely because Lennox, according to Pyres, sanitizes history and uses these evasive tactics, all while seeming calm and reasonable, his ideas become, in Pyres' words, even more insidious than a straightforward confrontational critique.
Insidious? Why?
Because the politeness, the calm delivery, makes the underlying problematic content, as Pyres sees it, harder to spot, harder to challenge effectively. It lets potentially misleading historical interpretations slide by because the speaker seems so nice.
It sounds like Pyre is arguing the packaging is deliberately or effectively masking what he views as flawed and historically inaccurate content.
That's exactly his point. His critique is about how arguments get built, how history gets used selectively, and how the way something is said can drastically affect how it's received, potentially hiding the problems Pyre identifies in the ideas themselves.
Okay, let's pivot now to the historical record itself. Or, more accurately, the historical claims Pyre makes in the article to push back against that idea that Christianity just showed up in places like Africa or Latin America as a purely positive civilizing force that saved them.
Pyre is incredibly direct here. He states flat out that the notion Christianity saved these regions from some kind of barbarism is, quote, historically false and offensive.
Offensive is a strong word. He clearly feels it dismisses the value of the societies that were already there.
Absolutely. He sees it as perpetuating a colonial viewpoint. And he backs this up, but painting a very different picture of how Christianity actually arrived, according to historical accounts he references.
Not a benevolent mission, then.
Far from it, in Pyre's telling. He argues Christianity didn't arrive gently or just spiritually. It was tangled up with violent conquest and exploitation right from the start.
How so?
He says it came with the conquistadors, with the slave ships, with land theft, genocide, and the wholesale dismantling of local cosmologies.
Wow, so invasion, destruction, forced cultural change.
That's the narrative Pyre presents, based on his sources. He argues the faith was fundamentally part of the machinery of empire, not separate from it.
And Pyre gives a specific, detailed example from Brazil, right? To show how deeply religious institutions were involved in things like slavery.
He really digs into the Brazil example. He makes this startling claim, citing historical sources, that the Catholic Church was actually one of the largest slave-owning institutions in colonial Brazil.
One of the largest, not just passively accepting it, but a major owner.
That's the assertion Pyre makes. And he explains the implications. He argues the church's own economic structures and even its theological frameworks were set up or used in ways that actively dehumanized people and commodified their labor.
So the institution itself facilitated treating people as property.
That's Pyre's argument. He suggests the church's structures and justifications supported this dehumanization, allowing it to profit from enslaved labor.
And he mentions specific historical documents.
Yes. He cites records that apparently show the church actually made it harder for enslaved people to buy their freedom.
Harder, not easier.
Exactly, which directly contradicts any idea that the church was maybe trying to help people escape slavery from within. Pyre presents evidence suggesting the opposite, that the institution was hindering freedom, presumably because it benefited economically from the system. They were stakeholders, according to Pyre.
And then there's that detail about the market.
Yeah. The most chilling detail Pyre includes is the claim that the church managed an organized market with official price tables for human lives.
Official price tables for people managed by the church.
That's the picture Pyre paints. based on his reading of the historical documentation. He uses it as stark evidence of how deeply complicit and involved the institution was. It suggests a bureaucratic, systematic commodification of human beings run by a religious body.
And this detail directly counters that narrative of a purely spiritual or benevolent presence.
Completely. Piers uses it to show the institution wasn't just observing or benefiting indirectly. It was, in this specific context, according to his sources, a central manager in the business of buying and selling people.
So Piers ties these disturbing historical specifics back to his main argument about how religious institutions gained their power and authority.
Absolutely. He uses this history from Brazil as a direct counter-argument to the idea that Christianity spread just because people found the message appealing.
Right.
Instead, Piers argues these details show the violent, exploitative ways religious institutions gained wealth, power, and moral standing in conquered territories. The history, as Piers presents it, fundamentally challenges that civilizing mission narrative and points instead to a legacy rooted in suffering and institutional cruelty.
This historical section is really the bedrock of Piers' critique of the happy convert idea, isn't it? Arguing that the narrative ignores or whitewashes this foundational violence.
It forces you to ask, how can an institution, allegedly involved so deeply in this kind of systemic oppression, simultaneously claim it arrived as a purely positive, saving force? Piers clearly believes these historical facts, as he presents them, undermine that positive story completely.
Okay, so Piers hits the historical narrative hard, arguing the damage was immense. But he doesn't stop there. He also argues that this damage continues in subtler but no less destructive forms today.
Yes, he shifts to contemporary issues. He argues the problematic legacy isn't just in the past. Even if overt colonialism changed, he sees destructive influences persisting.
And he gives that specific example related to public health in Africa again.
Right, the disinformation around health. He states that in many African countries, even today, the Catholic Church is spreading disinformation about condom use.
And the direct result, according to Piers.
He's blunt. It's fueling the HIV crisis with deadly consequences. He draws a straight line from the institution's stance on condoms to the continuation of a major health disaster.
He's saying the denial or discouragement of condom use directly leads to more infections and deaths.
That's his argument. And he notes that this kind of ongoing real-world harm rarely gets the spotlight in public debates about religion.
Compared to what?
Compared discussions about faith-giving hope or stopping those hypothetical witch doctors and machetes. Piers argues these actual documented health harms, which he attributes to religious influence, get overlooked in favor of the more positive, appealing stories. He sees it as part of that pattern of sanitizing the legacy.
This leads Piers to bring in another famous critic, Christopher Hitchens, specifically on the topic of apologies from religious institutions.
Right. Piers references Hitchens' well-known critique of how the Catholic Church, in particular, handles apologizing for its past actions.
What was Hitchens' take, as Piers presents it?
Piers summarizes Hitchens by saying that the Church's apologies for things like the Crusades, its role during the Holocaust, alliances with fascist regimes were always evasive and euphemistic.
Meaning they weren't really full apologies?
Not in Hitchens' view, as presented by Piers. They didn't represent a genuine admission of fundamental error.
And why did Hitchens think that was? What was the root cause, according to Piers?
Piers explains Hitchens' core argument. The Church fundamentally believes it holds the exclusive truth.
Okay.
Therefore, any action taken, even horrific violence or complicity, if it was done in the service of the truth, cannot, at its root, be truly wrong.
So the motive, serving the truth, protects the action from being fundamentally condemned.
That's the idea Piers attributes to Hitchens. The execution might be regrettable, individuals might have erred, but the institution acting on behalf of divine truth can't be fundamentally mistaken.
Which makes a genuine apology for the act itself impossible.
That was Hitchens' reasoning, as Piers conveys it. Because the Church believes it has a divine mandate based on this exclusive truth, it can't truly repent for actions taken to fulfill that mandate. Admissions will always be framed to protect the core claim to truth.
And Hitchens predicted this would just keep happening.
Piers says Hitchens predicted this cycle of partial admissions, careful wording and deflection, would just continue. Real apologies, Hitchens argued according to Piers, are impossible until the Church changes its basic stance on having the exclusive truth and a divine right to dictate based on it.
And Piers explicitly links this pattern Hitchens described back to his critique of Lennox. How?
He loops back to his earlier point. Piers claims that Lennox, in his observations, either completely avoids mentioning any wrongdoing by Christianity, Or, if he does express shame or regret, Pyers argues it's always filtered through that no true Scotsman lens.
So the blame is shifted away from real Christianity onto individuals who weren't true believers.
Exactly. Pyers presents this as fitting perfectly with the pattern Hitchens described, protecting the core faith or institution by blaming only flawed individuals. Pyers sees Lennox's method as part of this larger historical tendency of some religious bodies to dodge genuine accountability by redefining who counts as a real member when bad things happen.
So Pyers isn't just critiquing Lennox in isolation, but seeing his arguments as part of a broader apologetic strategy.
That seems to be the case he's building. He uses Hitchens to contextualize his critique, suggesting that the way apologies and historical harms are handled is deeply tied to the fundamental claims about truth and authority made by these institutions.
Okay, let's circle back fully now to the narrative that gives Pyers' article its name, the happy convert narrative. Pyers says Lennox uses this a lot.
Yes, Pyers highlights that Lennox frequently tells stories about individuals whose lives were dramatically improved by becoming Christian. He specifically mentions Lennox using an example of a young Chinese student finding transformation through the New Testament.
And these stories aren't just anecdotes for Lennox, according to Pyers. They serve a specific purpose in his arguments.
Right. Pyers argues Lennox presents these happy convert stories as empirical proof that Christianity works.
Proof.
The idea, as Pyers interprets Lennox, is that the truth claims of the faith literally manifest in changed lives. The positive personal transformation is offered as evidence validating the religious beliefs themselves.
So, subjective experience becomes objective proof for metaphysical claims.
That's how Pyers sees Lennox using it. But Pyers immediately attacks this whole approach, calling the happy convert narrative deeply flawed, both historically and philosophically.
Okay, let's break down Pyers' arguments against it. What's the first major issue he raises?
He challenges the basic assumption that conversion is always an act of free will. Pyers calls this view historically naive.
Naive because?
Because it completely ignores the vast historical circumstances where conversion was anything but free.
And he gives examples of this non-voluntary conversion.
Yes, he goes back to the colonial context again. In colonial Brazil, he points out, enslaved Africans weren't offered Christianity, they were forcibly baptized.
Right, baptism by mandate.
And their children weren't raised Christian because the family chose it, but by mandate, not choice. Religious identity was imposed as part of the system of control.
So religion was used as a tool within that system.
Pyers argues exactly that. Churches were complicit, and religion was weaponized for control and erasing existing cultures. For an enslaved person, adopting Christian practices might have been about survival or forced conformity, not a free spiritual choice.
And he links this to the present day, too.
Yes, he brings up contemporary Africa again, noting that Christianity's rapid growth there is often intertwined with those campaigns against condom use.
Suggesting that adhering to the faith can come with involuntary negative consequences, like health risks.
That seems to be the implication.
Yeah.
It complicates the idea that alignment with the faith only brings freely chosen positive changes. Pyers argues that Lennox, by focusing solely on the happy, voluntary stories, elides these facts.
He just ignores the coercion and the negative sides.
Pyers' point is that presenting Christianity's spread as purely a story of joyful, free choices is a major oversimplification that hides the coercion, the suffering, the complex realities involved. It's misleading, according to Pyers.
Okay, what's Pyers' second argument against using the happy convert as proof? He calls it philosophical. Comfort is not truth.
Right. Pyers acknowledges up front, yes, many people do find real comfort, meaning solace, in Christianity. He's not denying the subjective experience.
Okay, fair enough.
But his key counter is sharp. Comfort is not truth. Just because something makes you feel good or transformed doesn't make its underlying claims objectively true.
How does he flesh that out?
He brings in a psychological angle. He
Yeah.
suggests conversion and the comfort it brings can be understood as a complex psychological process. People in crisis or searching for meaning often look for belonging, hope, answers. And faith traditions can provide those, leading to powerful feelings of change.
But crucially, Pyers says this isn't unique to Christianity.
Exactly. He states very clearly that countless other belief systems and ideologies also transform lives. They provide comfort, meaning, belonging too. So positive transformation isn't specific evidence for Christianity, in Pyers' view?
And he uses a logical test here, doesn't he?
Yes, the reductio ad absurdum. He says, look, if the test for truth is simply, does it make people feel profoundly changed and comforted? Then logically you'd have to accept the truth claims of. Well, he names Scientology, political cults, and New Age movements as equally valid.
Because they also have followers who report radical positive changes.
Precisely. Pyers uses this to show the flaw, as he sees it, in using personal testimony as objective proof for metaphysical truth. Feeling good isn't the same as being right about the nature of reality.
And Pyers notes this isn't the first time Lennox has faced this specific criticism.
He mentions Peter Atkins, the physicist, apparently challenged Lennox on this exact point in a debate. Pyers says Atkins called Lennox's anecdotes evidence of psychological comfort rather than epistemic proof.
Meaning subjective benefit, not objective truth.
Right. And Pyers points out that in his view, Lennox hasn't really addressed this fundamental philosophical challenge to using anecdotes as proof.
Okay, what's the third major flaw Pyers identifies in the happy convert narrative? It's about incompleteness.
Yes. Pyers argues the narrative is selective because it only focuses on the positive snapshot and completely ignores everyone who later regrets converting or decides to leave the faith.
And he points out that's not a small number of people.
No, he explicitly states millions abandon Christianity yearly. It's a significant, ongoing phenomenon.
And leaving isn't always easy either.
Pyers notes that people often leave despite cultural or familial pressure, highlighting that the decision can be difficult and costly, which again complicates the simple finding happiness story.
He uses an analogy here.
The marriage analogy. Feeling happy in year one doesn't prove the marriage is fundamentally true or perfect or guarantee lifelong bliss. It's just one point in time.
So why does Pyers say ignoring apostasy or regret weakens Lennox's argument dramatically?
Because in Pyers' view, by cherry-picking only the positive lasting stories and ignoring the vast numbers who become disillusioned, have bad experiences, or leave, the narrative becomes fundamentally unrepresentative and biased.
Not the full picture.
Not at all. Pyers contends that any argument for truth based on personal experience needs to account for the whole range of experiences, including the negative ones and people walking away. By failing to do that, the anecdote loses its force as proof for anyone looking at the bigger picture.
It really sounds like Pyers is arguing the happy convert story functions more like effective marketing or, confirmation bias for believers rather than solid evidence.
That seems to be his conclusion. He's pushing for a view that includes the complexity, the history of coercion, the philosophical limits of subjective proof, and the reality that people also suffer within or leave the faith.
Pyers then tackles another specific argument he attributes to Lennox, this one connecting Christianity and intellectual success.
Yeah, Pyers mentions, Lennox sometimes points out that many Nobel laureates were Christians, using this in Pyers' interpretation to imply a link between Christian faith and high-level intellectual or scientific achievement.
Kind of suggesting Christianity fosters intellectual rigor.
Right, but Pyers pushes back hard with a historical counter-argument.
Which is?
He argues this completely ignores how Christianity acted as an institutional gatekeeper for centuries, especially in the West, where most early Nobel laureates came from.
Institutional gatekeepers. Meaning?
Pyers explains that for a very long time in Europe, top academic jobs, professorships, access to universities and honors were often explicitly reserved for Christians. Sometimes even specific denominations were required.
So getting ahead wasn't just about being smart, it was about having the right religious affiliation.
That's Pyers' point. He says brilliant people who weren't Christian. He mentions figures like Bertrand Russell and Einstein as examples of prominent non-Christian intellectuals of the time faced exclusion or discrimination from these very institutions because of their beliefs or lack thereof.
So the high number of Christian academics back then might not purely reflect faith-fostering intellect.
Pyers argues it fundamentally challenges that idea. He says the notion of a true intellectual meritocracy, where ability alone matters, is actually a recent invention, historically. He contrasts it with older universities like Oxford, which he claims once ran more on family lineage and religious conformity than just pure intellectual merit. Who you knew and what you professed matter hugely.
So Pyers' conclusion on this point?
He summarizes that Christianity's historical dominance in science and academia wasn't necessarily proof of its intellectual superiority, but owed as much to institutional privilege as to intellectual superiority.
It's shifting the focus from the belief itself to the power structures that favored believers.
Exactly. Pyers argues you can't just look at the outcome, lots of Christian academics, without considering the system that produced it, universities largely controlled by and favoring Christians. It forces a different interpretation of that historical data.
That point really makes you think differently about how we interpret historical representation in any field, doesn't it? You have to look at the systemic factors.
It moves the question from, did the belief cause the achievement, to did the institution control access to achievement? Pyers clearly leans towards the second explanation here.
Okay, we've covered a huge amount from Jorge Pyers' article. Let's try to synthesize the main threads and talk about why engaging with this specific critique based only on his source matters for you, the listener.
Well, the big takeaway from Pyers, running through the whole piece, is that this happy convert narrative, yes, it's a powerful rhetorical tool, it works well in debates maybe, but Pyers argues it's ultimately a logically weak argument when you really scrutinize it historically and philosophically.
And Pyers believes this narrative serves to hide or obscure certain things.
Yes, he argues it obscures the coercion, complexity, and contradictions embedded in Christianity's history. It paints a nice, clean picture by ignoring the messy, often violent realities of its expansion and influence.
And it leaves specific groups of people out of the story entirely.
Right. Pyers stresses it ignores those who resisted Christianity, those who left the faith, and those who suffered directly because of actions taken in its name, historically and even now.
So Pyers' challenge, essentially, is that if defenders like Lennox want to present Christianity as rational, good, freely chosen, they need to deal honestly with these difficult realities.
Exactly. They need to grapple honestly with these realities. The coercion, the suffering, the institutional power, not just rely on selective anecdotes and cleaned up histories. Intellectual honesty demands it, in Pyers' view.
Pyers also makes a slightly broader point near the end, maybe a bit surprising, about a shared tendency.
Yeah, he notes this discomforting tendency to sanitize Christianity's global legacy isn't only found among religious apologists. Pyers claims some prominent atheists do it too.
Really? Critics of religion sanitizing its history. Why does Pyers think that happens?
He doesn't go into huge detail on their motives, but the implication seems to be that maybe in focusing on other critiques, like science versus religion or doctrinal issues, some secular critics might inadvertently downplay or overlook just how central Christianity was to things like colonial violence, slavery, and cultural suppression.
So they might miss the historical power dynamics Pyers emphasizes.
Perhaps. Pyers feels that sometimes critiques focus elsewhere and can end up obscuring the human cost and historical power grabs in a way that, while different in motivation, has a similar effect to apologetics. It hides the full picture.
And Pyers sees real consequences to this shared sanitization, whether from believers or critics.
He argues it's serious. First, he says it robs colonized peoples of their historical memory.
How so?
By downplaying the violence and coercion, it diminishes the actual experiences, the suffering, the resistance of the people who were subjected to Christian expansion. It erases their part of the story.
And it also affects how we see the institutions today.
Yes. Pyers claims it obscures the violent means by which religious institutions gained their moral authority. It allows institutions that Pyers argues were deeply involved in things like slavery and conquest to present their current influence as stemming just from their pure message, rather than from centuries of using power, force, and exploitation. Confronting how they got authority is key to understanding them now.
So, wrapping up, why is it important for you, the listener, to spend time unpacking Pyers' specific critique just based on his article?
Well, engaging with a detailed critique like this really helps you hone your critical thinking skills. It pushes you to look past simple narratives, especially ones heavy on anecdotes or simplified history.
Yeah, it makes you question how historical legacies get built and debated, and maybe presented strategically.
And it brings home that point Pyers made right at the start about presentation style. How politeness or calmness can really influence how we judge an argument's substance, especially on sensitive topics.
It's a challenge to focus on the claims, the evidence, or lack of it, not just the speaker's tone.
Exactly. This deep dive gives you a concentrated look at one scholar's forceful pushback against common positive narratives, based entirely on his analysis.
It definitely shows how complex history is, and how the stories we hear are often selective, serving particular viewpoints.
Absolutely.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with, drawn from Pyers' core message here. He really makes the case that in debates, tone shouldn't outweigh content.
And alongside that, The idea that truly understanding the legacy of any powerful global force means confronting the uncomfortable bits, the complex motives, not just settling for comforting stories that might ignore inconvenient truths or the experiences of those who are harmed.
It's something to keep in mind when you hear any historical claim, especially about institutions with long histories of power. How much are you seeing the polished narrative? And how much are you considering the complex, maybe hidden realities Pyers insists we need to face?